Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome into Garden of Doom, and this week we are very fortunate to be joined by Ginny Myers-Saint. She's a best-selling author on the New York Times. I think our first New York Times best-selling author. I know we've had some Amazon bestsellers in several categories, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to go with, yes, our first New York Times best-selling author of 2 books, Dark and Shallow Lies from 21 and Secrets So Deep from this very year, 2022, both from Razorbill Books, Penguin, Teen. This is in the young adult category. But then again, so is Harry Potter and Twilight. So obviously those things can go, as I say, broadband, but far beyond young adult. One Last Breath is going to be released in 2024. And while she's a theater kid at heart, obviously she's had great success in writing, but she's still spent most of her career teaching, acting, and directing plays. She lives in St. Cloud, Florida with her teenage son, but she was a referral from a prior guest, Stephanie Theben, who was on the Halloween show, who was a dear friend of mine for many, many years, actually decades at this point, from Oklahoma. And want to get a little bit into the books, obviously, but she's won some awards. She won the Independent Bookstore bestseller list. She's also won the 2022 Crystal Kite Award from the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators in the Texas and Oklahoma region, and the Whippoorwill Book Award, which is given to recognize books honestly reflecting the complexity and diversity of rural life. Her book was also an Amazon editor's pick and a Barnes & Noble Young Adult Book of the Month. Other honors for Dark and Shallow Lies include being nominated for a Thriller Award from the International Thriller Writers and being a 2022 nominee for the Oklahoma Book Award. So obviously a lot of praise for the book, a lot of success for the book. I took a little bit of research and saw on one site there were almost 9,000 reviews. On Amazon there were almost 900 reviews. Mostly very favorable reviews, and people seem to be looking forward to the next book. So we're thrilled to have her on the program, as my friend Mike Hilliard says from the Red Line podcast. So Ginny Myers-Saint, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate your time. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I don't know where you want to start. I think we spoke a little bit in pre-production. First I want to know, what defines the young adult category?
Yeah, so young adult is a relatively new category as far as literature goes. When I was a young adult, there was no such thing as young adult. There were children's books and there were adult books, and there wasn't really anything in between. So young adult's a category that kind of came into being. Twilight is really sort of the first phenomenally successful young adult book that sort of launched that category into being something that was sort of everyone was aware of. There were always young adult books. The Outsiders is very much a young adult book, but it was not considered a young adult book because young adult wasn't a thing. And so, the main thing about young adult, especially these days, is it can encompass pretty much any topic. There's nothing that's off limits in young adult. Some of it's very dark, some of it's very deep. So it can be about anything. What young adult is defined by really is the age of the characters, the main characters. So if your characters are, between the ages of say 15 and 19, that falls into the category of young adult. And that's not always necessarily true. There are some books where the characters are young, but they are still considered young adult books. And those are mostly books where it's like written where someone's looking back on their youth or something like that. So mostly young adult books are feature young adult characters in the present tense, doing and exploring and figuring out their lives. The key to that is kind of that young adult is about finding your place in the world and finding yourself in that journey of self-discovery that we kind of think of as like coming of age. That's sort of what marks something as young adult.
Growing up is hard enough without there being supernatural and extra burdens put upon you to be more of the outcast, which everyone probably feels like they're more of an outcast than they really are when they're growing up. It's fun when you're, we're probably similar in age. When you go back and you talk to your high school friends on Facebook or whatever, and they describe you to you, and you're like, no, I wasn't the cool popular one. You were in the cool popular club. And they're like, we weren't in the cool popular club. You always had the parties and all that. I'm like, people were just using me for the party. And it goes around and round. It's like people's perception of you and your perception of you, they're usually completely different. The other thing about being a young adult that I imagine is a challenge for an author is no matter what's going on, a teenager always is going to find time and space in their head for, let's just call it romance. That may be too big a word for a teenager, teenage love, but puppy love or whatever. But there's always that. You could be being chased by monsters, but always somewhere there's going to be like, maybe I'll get a kiss later. That's.
Yeah, romance is definitely an important part of the young adult category. There are some young adult novels and series and things that don't have that, or that have it as a very minor subplot. There are romances in both of my books. They're not central. They're not the plot of the story, but they're certainly there as part of the subplot. And that's such an important part of that stage of life. Like you said, that first experience of falling in love or having that first crush or whatever. We sort of, I think, looking back as adults, tend to try to negate the importance of that, by writing it off as puppy love or a crush or something. But if you really think back and remember how intense those feelings are at that point, and in not every case, or even a lot of cases, how genuine that is. My brother married his high school sweetheart. They've been happily married for many, many years. So kids that age can and do experience love and first love in such a all-encompassing way that to leave it out of that category or to not highlight it would be sort of disingenuous to the experience of being a teenager. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there's a old saying that says good judgment comes from experience comes from bad judgment, and I think that's what that's in some regards that's what puppy love often is. And you learn how to have proper relationships by not doing so well, the first few times. Now, some people get lucky, like I think you said your brother there, and then it works out the first time, or they're on the same page of they're sort of making the same mistakes at the same time, and it's cool. But yeah, that's fun. It's just I I think one of the parts when everyone tells you certain shows are good, and a lot of times they're, you friends of different generations, whatever, and you check out a show and you go, this isn't for me. This is for a 14-year-old. This is for a 22-year-old, or whatever. But one thing I always see is that the kids always seem to be focused on one partner. Like they always, and I remember being a teenager, and as many letters there are in as many alphabets, that's as many plans as you have. You're rarely just focused on one person, and that's always felt a little bit artificial to me on a TV or whatever. When you're 15, if you can't get the girl you like, or the guy or whatever, you might there might be half a dozen other around that you'd be like, yeah, that'd be okay too. And I don't know how that gets depicted in literature and media, because I don't watch things for people that age, generally. But every now and then I stumble upon something which seems to capture that without it hitting you over the head. Like I think Wednesday on Netflix right now is like delightful.
Oh yeah, I've seen that, but I've heard it's great.
Yeah, it's a nice little surprise. Anyway, enough about Jeff and his awkward, disclosures about the ineptness of his teenage years. Let's talk about. Maybe it's probably best to go through the books first, and then sort of talk about the background. The small and rural town thing, I think that's sort of cool now. Like Nope was a big sensation, and that was sort of like supernatural and sort of a small and rural. Yellowstone, there's not much supernatural unless you consider the First Nations aspects of it. It's small and rural. It's sort of like the Americana, red-blooded fantasy kind of thing of True Grit kind of thing. But so the first book was Dark and Shallow Lies, and it took place in some place called La Cachée, Louisiana. Bayou Town, which of course brings me, to Bon Thème from True Blood. I remember that. And La Cachée is the psychic capital of the world. So what was your inspiration for this book? The main character's name is Gray, and the names seem to be unusual, and I have to believe there's some reason for that. So why don't you take us to this world a little bit, and like, what does La Cachée mean? It doesn't mean, yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, when I was first working on, thinking about writing a young adult book, I knew I wanted to write something with sort of a mysterious supernatural thriller kind of bent to it. But I wasn't sure what that would be, because that's always the sort of thing I enjoyed reading. So I knew that was, something that I would be interested in writing. And I wanted to write for young adults, particularly because I'd taught and directed theater with high school students for many, many years, and just loved kids that age. And they were so passionate and loyal and enthusiastic, and, just so cool to work with. And I'd spent so much time with them. I knew those voices in my head. Those are the voices I heard. And I knew those were the stories I wanted to tell. But I wasn't sure what that story would be. My son and I were in Florida, and we had taken a road trip up to see the manatees at Blue Springs State Park, which is a thing you do in the winter in Florida. You go up to see the manatees, and they come in because it's cold. They come in the spring, stays a constant temperature. So we went up to see the manatees, and it was very cool. There were hundreds of manatees all huddled together in the spring. But the thing is about manatees, they don't really do anything. So we walked up and down the little spring. We walked around it. We looked at the manatees, and we said, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool! Look at all those manatees." And then there wasn't really anything to do after that. And that was kind of it. That didn't take up a lot of time. So I thought, well, we've driven up here from Orlando. Let's see what else might be around here that we could check out. I wouldn't have any cell service out there at the state park. We're in the middle of nowhere. But we did have this old guidebook that I had picked up somewhere and shoved in the glove box years ago. Florida, tourist attraction guidebook. Yeah. And it mentioned a place called Cassadaga, Florida. So Cassadaga, Florida, is a little place not too far from Gainesville. It's kind of in central Florida, in that area. And it is the psychic capital of the world. That's what they call themselves. And it's a tiny little place about maybe I don't know how many permanent residents, less than 1,000, I would imagine. Tiny. And it has a little town square. And the town square is nothing but palm readers and crystal shops and rock shops and tarot card readers and all of that sort of stuff. And the only other thing they have there is a bookstore. like a spiritualist bookstore, and we stopped there to check it out. I thought, well, that sounds interesting. Let's swing in there and just take a look around. So we did, and I was standing there on the bookstore porch, looking at all of these interesting business establishments all around Casadega, Florida, and I thought, what a cool place this would be to set a story. And then this question kind of popped into my head, and most of my stories start with a question, and that question was, how would you keep a secret in a town full of psychics? So that's kind of where that story came from. And so La Cachette means the hiding place, and so that's what it means. And it's I put that town, I took the idea of the psychic town from Casadega, Florida. And the thing about Casadega, Florida is it's right on I-4, which is one of the busiest stretches of interstate in the United States. And you can hop right on and hop right off. And, so it's very easy to get to and get away from. And I needed someplace more isolated, a little harder to get into and harder to get out of. Many years ago, I spent a lot of time in Louisiana. I'm from Oklahoma, grew up in Oklahoma and lived in Oklahoma most of my life, in Arkansas for about half my life. But I never lived in Louisiana, but I spent a lot of time there. And at one point, we were down there. We took a cruise down the lower Mississippi, like a history cruise kind of thing, and ecology, nature kind of thing. And they pointed out, the guide pointed out this sort of boardwalk falling apart that was over on one side of the river, down at the very bottom of the river, and explained that was the location of Pilot Town, Louisiana. And that Pilot Town was a place, like if you had a big cargo ship out in the Gulf and you were piloting that boat at sea and you needed to get it upriver to port in New Orleans, you could not navigate the river yourself. You needed to take on an experienced riverboat pilot, someone that really knew the river, because the Mississippi is very treacherous, very dangerous, very hard to navigate. So those big ships would stop there at Pilot Town. They would onboard a riverboat pilot who would pilot that ship upriver to Port New Orleans. So that's who lived in Pilot Town. It was just the riverboat captains and their families, and it was a little community. I mean, at one time they had like a church and a little school and a grocery store. But it was accessible only by boat, one way in, one way out, and very small. And so that became sort of the geographical inspiration for where that story was set. And Pilot Town had kind of almost seen the end of its time by the time I saw it, because with, more like computer guided navigation and all of that, it became less important. To have that available. And then, unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina kind of finished it off and never came back. But the combination of those two towns is where that inspiration came from.
Okay, very interesting. The thing about New Orleans is that it is sort of always associated with something mysterious. I don't know if it's because it's everything's French and the rest of us are more British or something like that. Or whatever it is, but I recently did shows. I think I know they were both aired in October with Mambo Brandy, obviously a voodoo priestess, and proprietor of Voodoo Authentica, and she referred me to Papa Czar, who's also a voodoo priest and a vampire. Yeah, they interviewed him.
New Orleans got a really rich history, we've got lots of like vampire lore, and we've got lots of that voodoo tradition and the mystery sort of that from the outside of it, has always, I think, sort of fascinated people. And just that blending of cultures and music and all sorts of people coming together, and then all of the things they bring to that area sort of get blended into something that's really unique and fascinating and unlike any place else in the United States, for sure.
Yeah, it's sort of like our Babylon, it's sort of like everyone goes to mix there, and Mardi Gras is the ultimate party, and sort of like everything goes, or at least that's how the romance goes of it. So so we have a murder in a town full of psychics, which I don't know if that impeaches the psychics or means that the murderer is somebody with superior, like the Professor X of psychics from the X-Men. So what's going on in this story without giving too much away? Because obviously we want to help sell some of the books, if possible. And I think my audience is young, and the ones that aren't, they've got kids or no kids, right?
That's a funny thing about young adult is I would say my readers are probably 50-50, teens and adults. I get probably just as much correspondence from adults who have read and enjoyed those stories as teens, and I think that's because the thing is, all adults were once young adults, and we remember those years. And in a lot of ways, you have such like a nostalgic yearning for memory of what that was, and you don't forget that. Like you grow up, you get older, but some part of you stays that very much. So definitely it appeals to all ranges. But this is a story about a group of kids. There are 10 kids. In this tiny little psychic town, all born the same summer. They call them the summer children, and they've grown up together, a very close-knit group. And one of them has gone missing. And her best friend has come back to town. She had left and gone off somewhere else, and comes back that summer to try to find out what's happened to her friend. And, of course, it's very mysterious to her that in a town full of psychics, no one claims to know where this girl is or what happened. So then she starts digging into what happened, and she finds out there's a whole lot she doesn't know about this place she has always called home, and these people she has always thought she knew inside out. So it's a very much a book about small town secrets and generational secrets, and sort of the power of secrets to take us down. If we're not careful. But it's also very much a book about grief and about how you move on after the loss of something that you thought would be insurvivable.
Right. What kind of research or experience do you have with sort of the psychic world and sort of the other occult, supernatural that, obviously that would have to go into the book as well?
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I am a skeptic about everything. Mm-hmm. I'm not psychic. I've had my palm read in New Orleans, sure. And the tarot card thing and all that. And I'm pretty skeptical across the board about everything. But I'm a skeptic who is really fascinated and interested in everything. So I love those stories. I grew up loving ghost stories and stories about the paranormal. I've never been necessarily a believer in it, but I want to be. I would like to be. Mm-hmm. I would love to see a ghost and be proven wrong or whatever, because I'm really drawn to those kinds of stories. So it's not something that I knew a lot about. It's something that I was always sort of interested in, like peripherally. But I did a lot of research as far as different psychic abilities, and all that kind of stuff. Which made it a really fun story to research. There was, especially with the setting being in New Orleans, because I had spent a lot of time there. I'm really familiar with that landscape and with people and with culture. But there were still, a lot of things that I needed to dive a little deeper into. So a lot of research, definitely, but it was all fun, interesting research.
What were there any commonalities or stark differences? Like, what were the main points that you took with you that you said, this has to make it into the book?
It was just sort of the fact that one of the things I was most interested in was the concept of whether people who genuinely believe they have these gifts were able to control those gifts, or whether they were sort of controlled by those gifts. And that's sort of a theme that I explored a lot in the story. Like, if you have this ability either to know things or to understand things that are sort of beyond other people's comprehension, is that a gift or is it a curse? And then how do you sort of live with that knowledge and that power, and is there an ability to turn it off, if you don't want that, or is it just something that you're sort of stuck with? So that was something that was sort of fun to explore.
Did you have to familiarize with yourself with the kind of flora and herbs and things like that, or different kinds of crystals and that's like I said, that's not something I knew a lot about, but it's something that I sort of find interesting. I think, like for instance, in New Orleans, I love those shops and the botanical shops and things like that. You go in there and everything is just like beautiful and mysterious, and it all smells so good. So I'd always sort of been drawn to those places and that idea of that. But I didn't know a lot about it. So yeah, specifically in that sort of thing, because Honey, Bray's grandmother in the book, runs the shop
that is a bookstore and a crystal shop, and all sorts. She's got all sorts of fascinating things in there, and I wanted it very much to be that kind of shop that you walk into and it's just like crammed with interesting stuff and interesting smells, and so I did a lot of research on that kind of stuff for sure.
Did you have to learn how to read tarot?
Just barely, just enough to make sure that I wasn't getting it wrong, because I didn't want to, and it was really important to me also, although I'm not necessarily a believer in a lot of like psychic or mysticism or spiritualism, that kind of thing, I do respect it, and I respect the people that do believe it and do practice it. And so it was very important to me that if I'm going to depict these things, that I wanted to get it right. So I did try to make sure that I at least knew enough to talk about what I needed to talk about.
Like, how do you do it? Do you go into the stores and do you just talk to people, or do you try to employ someone, whether financially or just convince them that you're coming in good faith to educate you? Like how do you research, or do you just read a lot of books?
I did because I have spent a lot of time in New Orleans. I did do a lot of shop browsing and question asking and that kind of thing. But also now these days, like you can find out pretty much anything about anything without leaving your couch. And so I did a lot of reading, a lot of Googling, and a lot of that kind of thing.
Hence the show.
Yeah. And we did have a what's called an authenticity reader that Penguin brought in to do a read over of the book before it went to print. And that was and although his area of expertise was not particularly mysticism and psychic, like that kind of stuff, he was a just born and bred South Louisiana filmmaker who knew that culture and those people inside and out, and the flora and the fauna, like you said, and the geography and all of that, just to give it a read over and make sure that it rang true and that it was treated those cultures respectfully and that all of that kind of thing. And he also had some knowledge about that sort of stuff just from growing up and being sort of surrounded by it. So that was nice too, to have that kind of layer of double checking, making sure that we had it all right.
That's amazing. That's great that a publishing house has their in-house or internal expert that they can turn to, who not only reads it for authenticity, but sort of is like a expert editor or consultant anyway, to say.
Yeah, that's pretty common. And they're not in-house usually. Like they sought him out. Right. He was actually a film professor at Tulane. So anytime, because I'm not from, there's a lot of different cultures, like I said, involved in this book, and to have written it without the inclusion of those cultures and those people would have been inaccurate and disingenuous to what that experience of being in that geographical place is, because it's so important to it. But as someone who is outside of a lot of those cultures and outside of a lot of those experiences, it was important to make sure that we were getting it right, that we'd done the research, that we put in the good faith and work to make sure we were properly reflecting that with respect and with authenticity. And that's something that happens a lot in the publishing industry, whether it's a different, whether it's like a racial or cultural or historical or whatever. And there are people that will come in and double check those specific kinds of things, which is very helpful.
Yeah, I would think the flavor, it's like one thing if you're making a film and you're showing this local scenery, but it's nothing if you have to write the flavor. You have to make sure that you have the right scents and smells and the right insects in the right season. Absolutely. When do you hear crickets, or when do you hear cicadas, or frogs, or you can't be there without hearing a cacophony of frogs croaking at starting at 4 o'clock, and people will know. Anyway, I would like to move and I'm sorry I didn't warn you about this, but it didn't occur to me, from this part of the occult to something that would be occult to everybody. How does one go from, taking their vision, putting it into a book, and then turning that into published? So in other words, how does someone get published? How do you like?
Yeah, sure. There are different ways to do that. Particularly these days. Basically, you've got two options. you can do what's called self-publishing, which means that, you write and publish whatever you want to write and publish. And pretty much anyone can do that. You can publish on Amazon, or there are lots of other venues and ways to get your work out there.
Right.
And the other option is to be traditionally published, which is what my books are. And traditional publishing is very much the way it's always been. You write, you submit to a publishing house, who then decides if they want to publish it or not. And these days, particularly if you want to submit to a large publishing house, obviously like Penguin's, like the biggest publisher in the world, and they've got lots of imprints and divisions and that sort of thing. If you want to submit to Penguin or to any other good-sized publisher, you've got to go through a literary agent. And that's because publishers would be so inundated with millions and millions and millions of manuscripts that they would never be able to read them and go through them and wade through that pile. So literary agents in the traditionally publishing world kind of act as, I don't want to say a gatekeeper, but that's kind of what it is, to make sure that the publishing houses get the best work submitted to them, and they kind of do the process of weeding through sort of some of the other stuff. So the first thing you've got to do, obviously, is write a book and finish it, which is the step where most people sort of fall out of the process. I know a lot of people who have started a lot of books, very few who have finished them. So the first thing to do if you want to be a published writer is to finish a book. But if you've managed to do that, then you've already moved into a pretty small minority. So you've got to find a literary agent, which is a part of the process, again, where a lot of people kind of get stalled because it's a very difficult thing to do. It takes some people years and years to find an agent. I was pretty lucky. It didn't take me quite, that long, but it's a really hard process. And then what you do is you query them, which means you send them a nice letter about how you'd like them to be your literary agent and a couple of chapters of your manuscript, or 50 pages or whatever it is they ask for. And generally then what happens is they read it and you hear nothing ever again as long as you live. So you submit to 20 or 30 more, and you hear nothing from most of those. You get a polite no from most of some more of them. And then maybe somebody wants to see a little bit more, so you send them that. But it's a really daunting process, and it's a really long process. It's a really hard process because, literary agents take on not a huge number of clients. So it's a really hard process. And they get, I think, agents get hundreds of query submissions a week, particularly, big top agents. And to get their attention is very, very difficult. So that's that's the point in the process where a lot of people, if they have managed to finish the book, kind of that's where a lot of them next get stalled out. But if you get the agent, then you're great. You kind of work with your agent, get that manuscript polished up, ready to go, and start the submission process. And, so then the agent is the one that sends that manuscript out to publishers, and their job as an agent is to know which publishers, and more specifically, which editors at which publishing company to get which manuscript in front of. So hopefully they know what they're doing. They submit it out to the right people. For Dark and Shallow Lies, that process went really quickly. It was on submission less than a week before it sold at auction. Some books, take multiple rounds of submission before they land in the right place.
Wait, what's that mean? Auction? Does that mean the different publishing houses bid on the rights?
Yeah, so it's just what it sounds like. So for the first round of submissions, my agent sent that manuscript out, I think, to 10 different publishers, and I think we had 6 that were seriously interested. And then maybe 5 or so that ended up in an auction, which is basically a bidding situation, where they bid on that manuscript, and it happens in rounds, and so this is the first offer from these companies, and then we'd go up, say, what's your next offer, and your next offer, until we get to kind of a final round, like make your best and final offer, and that's it's just like any other auction. Is
it always the most money wins, or do some publishers offer better terms, like more royalties?
I mean, obviously that's important, but it's not always, because there are some things, that can kind of offset that. For instance, maybe a faster publishing timeline. If someone says, I can offer you a little less money, but we can get this book out in a year. Whether as opposed to I can offer you more money, but it's our next slot is 2 years from now, for publication. And it's a long process, like to get a book from the point where it's purchased by a publishing company to where it's on the shelves is a long process. That's it happened for me in a year because it was a very condensed timeline, but oftentimes it's 2 years easy from acquisition of a manuscript to holding, to seeing that book in a bookstore.
How much negotiation do you have with royalties or commissions or upfront advance? I mean, especially as a new author, are there clauses in the contract that says, as a new author, this is, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, you get this. But if there's a sequel, then it increases to this, or if we, pick you up for multi-books, then it increases to this, or is it you make your best first contract and you're sort of stuck with that for the first, whatever?
That is what your agent is for.
Okay.
To make sure that you have the best possible terms. And I tell people all the time, like, my agent is amazing. Not only from understanding writing and how to help make a story, polish it up, and make it the best it can be. Like, he's a genius at that, but also just shrewd. He has to be a shrewd businessman as well. Got to understand contract negotiations and all of that stuff. But his job, as my agent, is to go to bat for me. He is kind of the go-between between me and Penguin, to say, like, this is what we want, this is what we're asking for, and he has that knowledge to know what's reasonable to ask for, like, what can we get, without just being way over the top, but also without settling, for something that's less than we could have had. So that's the job of a good agent, to make sure you've got a really solid contract, to make sure there's no clause in there that's going to come back and bite you, or that you're going to regret later, to make sure you get the best possible terms, and to then not just, a good agent doesn't just work with you for that sale. Like, my agent is very involved, in every email and every correspondence I have with my editor and with Penguin, whether it's about cover design or it's about financial terms, or whether it's about any of that stuff. Like, he's right there with me for all of that, which is great because most writers are not business people. That's not often our strong suit. So it's really important to have someone who really understands not just the creative side of it, but that it is a business. I mean, it's very much a business. It's very much a business from a publisher's. Penguin is always going to be looking out for their bottom line and their best interest, and it's really important then, as a tiny little one-person writer going up against, Penguin, and that you have, or any large publisher, that you have someone who really knows what they're doing. And Penguin's been great to work with. They've been wonderful. I love my editor. I've had the best experience working with her on 2 books, well, now 3. And just couldn't be happier with Razorbill particularly. So it's a wonderful relationship. It's been a wonderful experience, but it's still very important to have someone who really knows what they're doing.
Okay, well then let's figure out this. How do you select the best agent, especially when it's hard to find an agent? Like, how can you do due diligence and find out what agent is reputable? I imagine, everyone hears the horror stories about the model agents that are at the local mall.
I mean, that's very important. I talk about this a lot, and having a bad agent is worse than having no agent. So it's important to really be careful when you get involved in that kind of relationship with someone, because you do need someone not only who knows what they're doing, but also someone that you trust. It's a really important relationship. And the best way to do that is like you said, to do your due diligence, to do research, to find out what they've published, to really look into not just them, but the agency that they work with. There are going to be reviews. There are going to be people who are willing to talk about bad experiences, whether it's on Twitter or different websites. Just do a lot of research into it. And also, it depends very much on what your goals are and sort of what your vision is for your book. My agent is kind of like a rock star agent. He's a sort of a top agent in specifically the young adult world, and that's awesome. That's great. But being at a big agency and being a really well-known agent isn't super important. What's important is that they really know what they're doing, and he does, and really understands the creative side and the business side. And if you have a book that you are interested in publishing, with a smaller publisher or something like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge agency to be a great agency, or to be a well-known agent to be a wonderful literary agent. You just got to do your research and make sure they know what they're doing. And there are red flags to watch out for. Like, an agent should never ask you for money up front. An agent takes a cut of what you make, and it's a standard cut. So look into like what the term should be. But if they're asking you for money up front, if they're asking you for anything that just seems off, just do your research. And there are lots of websites and places and people that will answer those questions for you and help you if they can.
Okay, you write a book, it's your baby. Now you're trusting an agent to do it, and you're trusting that agent to submit it to a publishing house. So there's two cogs there in that wheel that are not you, that have your baby. Now your creative, your intellectual property. Are non-disclosure agreements involved, or is that just not done because once you trust the agent, you trust the agent, and the agent knows that the publishers aren't going to steal it?
No, I mean, I think that is a worry. I mean, it's a worry that people ask about a lot. Like, what if I send this out and my agent steals my book and publishes it, like, right. Or whatever? And it's just not a thing that happens. It's like sort of an imaginary scenario. It's sort of like, excuse me. It's sort of like back when people were like really worried about like people slipping razor blades into Halloween candy. Like it got a lot of attention and people were really interested in it, but it really doesn't happen. So that's not so much a thing to worry about. I mean, I can't say that can never happen if you have a really unusual situation. But if you've got an agent, like, and you've done your research and you know that you're submitting to someone who is actually an agent and not just some random person who popped up on your Twitter or whatever and said, "Hey, I'm an agent, send me your manuscript," then yeah, that's certainly not something that I would worry about.
Who owns your copyright?
Well, Penguin owns the copyright for the U.S. Rights and the North American rights. So the way sales work is you can sell either like world rights or North American rights or like North American English rights. So because my agent's a great agent, and I wouldn't have known the difference here, when that contract was negotiated with Penguin, they were given the rights to North American English edition. So basically, they have the right to publish that book in the U.S. and Canada, and how that works. And then the rest of the world rights, we retain to then sell to other foreign publishers. So Dark and Tell Lies has been sold, and Secret Study will be published in the UK by a completely different publisher, in Germany, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, and I can't even remember where all. But each one of those sales is to a different publisher in a different country, which means for me, and a separate advance and separate royalties and all of that. So that is owned by different people in different geographic locations. The difference is if your publisher has world rights to your book, if that's something that's written in the contract, then they can sell that manuscript, say, to a publisher in the UK or a publisher in Czechoslovakia or a publisher in Russia. And then that money from that sale goes to your publisher because they've sold rights that belong to them, as opposed to you retaining them for yourself.
Gotcha. And I imagine your agent helps you apply for copyrights in those various other countries or the EU.
Yeah. So my agent is Park and Fine Literary Agency, and they have a foreign rights department who they handle all of the sending it out, to different publishers in different countries, and then all of those contract negotiations and all of that legal stuff that happens when you make money in a different country, and all of that thing. And so all I really have to do is when they send me the email, say, someone in Czechoslovakia is interested in publishing it. Here's the information. Here's how much they're offering. Is this something you want to do? All I really have to do is say yes or no. And then they handle all the rest of it, which is fabulous because it's amazingly complicated and not something I would ever be able to handle. And that's one of the reasons I chose traditional publishing over self-publishing. I have I have particularly one good friend who does phenomenally with self-publishing, but she is a wonder as far as being her own marketing team, legal team, design team, and that's just not me. I don't have that skill set.
Okay, excellent. Well, listen, I thank you very much for your indulgence on all that, because audience, I promise you, I did not prep her for this. I didn't even raise it as a possibility. She may have suspected it somewhere because she knows Stephanie's a lawyer. That's not I'm giving anything away, because Stephanie was on the show and we talked about how we know each other. So you probably knew I was a lawyer too. So audience, if you enjoyed this kind of information, this is sort of almost like a crossover with my sister show, Garden Views. But you're getting on Garden of Doom. So if you like this, check out Garden Views, because these are the kinds of talks that we have. So now let's going to move back into the regular occult, into the books, into the fun stuff. Before we move into the next book, what kind of powers does Gray have and Allura have, and like the other categories? Do you get much into that?
Yeah, definitely. So everyone in that town sort of has their own special ability. All of those 10 kids that I mentioned originally each have a specific psychic ability that they have. Ray comes in and functions very much sort of as the, and you see this a lot. This is a sort of a common theme in literature. The person who has gone away, the outsider who's coming back to their home place after some time away, and sort of viewing it from the lens of someone who is part insider, part outsider. And she is the only one of those 10 kids that comes back not yet knowing what her gift is, or what her ability is going to be. And that's something that she discovers over the course of the book, and discovers that although she was originally felt very sort of separated and cut off because she didn't feel like she had some ability or some psychic gift that everyone else had, she comes to realize that maybe this is something she was better off not having. So that's part of the discovery in the book, is her sort of coming into herself and what her ability is and how she can handle it and live with it.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I saw that the book was compared, or at least said, if you enjoy X, you'll enjoy this. And one of the X's was Where the Crawdads Lie, which I know is a movie, and it's on one of my streaming services. I've been curious about it, so now I think I'm going to see it, because now I have a reference.
I get that comparison a lot, and that's something that pops up a lot. And Where the Crawdads Sing, I think we get that comparison just because of the geographical location. Like that's the similarity there. It's very much a bayou story. Both of them are very set in very sort of secluded, remote areas of the Louisiana Bayou, and there's a lot of similarities as far as the setting and kind of the atmosphere of the story. So I think that's mostly what that comparison is. There are alligators and cypress trees and lots of water.
Right, of course, all the Scooby-Doo tropes. But yeah, I mean, we've had Interview with a Vampire, we've had True Blood, we've had True Detective, which all in the Bayou. I'm sure I'm missing dozens, but yeah, it's almost you can't even consider one without the other.
Fascinating, like formidable setting, and the thing that's always drawn me to that setting in particular, and why I love that part of the country, is that it is a terrifying place. There's anything out there could kill you. There's a lot of danger out there, but it's also always to me been there's so much beauty there, in the idea of this truly like beautiful place that is deadly is what has always sort of drawn me to that particular setting.
So a year later, now I'm sure that the first book took you a long time to write and you went through all this journey, but a year later you get another book published. And it's called Secrets So Deep. And it is not a continuation. It's a different young woman.
Totally different standalone, yeah.
And in a different place. So, for people who don't want to get into series where you have to read about the same characters over and over again, this is not that. So this is another teen, a 17-year-old girl. Her name's Avril. And she and her mom died at a theater camp. So thematically, you have sort of a commonality there. Obviously, I guess that maybe you were influenced by Crystal Lake like I would, or going to the camp, or just so many people live, in some sort of urban or suburban setting that camp is almost the only ruralness in their life. But tell us a little bit about this book, because it's more about ghosts. It seems like it's more of a ghost story and an old whaling. I mean, I love that kind of thing. The Flying Dutchman, Moby Dick, whatever. Anything bleak, and because you got the water and you got the cold and everything's gray and white, and absence of color. It's it's very much like the Thing and the Terror. These are it's like the closest thing you can get to space, like Alien. In space, no one can hear you scream. Well, try the Arctic, or the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, that book. So when my original contract with Penguin was a 2-book contract, so I always knew there would be a second book. I did not know what that book would be. It didn't exist when I signed that contract, which is a little intimidating, but you don't want to say no to a 2-book contract. So I said, sure, I can write a second book. And of course, like you said, it had to be written on a much more condensed timeline because, it's under deadline. But I had always wanted to tell a theater story. I grew up in the theater. I've always worked in the theater. That's where my heart has always been. I knew I wanted to tell a story set in that world because I think that it just sort of lends itself to that supernatural, paranormal experience. That idea of things that are real but not real is very much something we sort of play with all the time in the theater. And so it seemed like a good fit. And then to set it in Connecticut on the coast, I spent a long time, 6 summers, working at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center in Waterford, Connecticut, which is right on Long Island Sound. And that's very much where the geographical inspiration for that particular story came from. Specifically, being in that sort of the theater complex, which is, just right there on the Sound. And every evening we would stand sort of on the back porch of this big old farmhouse that was sort of the center of the theater. And you could literally watch the fog sort of roll up the lawn toward the theater, and then it would kind of envelop it. And once that fog rolled in every night, things seemed so different. Like, it was very disorienting, and places that were familiar were suddenly unfamiliar, and directions and distances seemed odd, and sounds, you could tell where sounds were coming from because it was muffled and distorted and bounced off the fog. And so that's something that I went back to tell that story very much.
Very interesting. You know what? I want to backpedal just for a second before I forget it, because I'm 54 and I forget things. What is an author's, or your feeling? I mean, obviously you don't speak for all authors, but I imagine there's a similar. How do you feel about the secondary market, like Amazon selling used books? Do you still get a piece of that, or is it just something it just can't be controlled, or?
No. Authors, traditionally published authors, or any others, really, I guess, you don't get a cut of used sales. Now, like, it depends on how it works. If Penguin, if Penguin has, like, they print so many copies of your book and they have some left and they sell those then to a secondhand distributor, you get a cut of that initial sale. Where Penguin sells it to a distributor. But as far as like individuals reselling and all of our like used bookstores, and that kind of stuff, you don't. And that it doesn't really bother me, because that's kind of the way everything works. That's just how it is. And all you can do is hope that you've got somebody who's doing enough marketing on the front end to make those first time sales, what they should be. But anything that gets the book out there, so if you buy a used copy of Dark and Shallow Lies, whether it's a used bookstore or secondhand on Amazon or eBay or whatever, or your cousin gives it to you, or you check it out from the library, maybe you're still more likely than to go and buy a new copy of Secret So Deep because you enjoyed that first story. Right. So that's how I kind of try to think of it. It's keeping it out there, it's keeping it in circulation, it's keeping it in people's sort of minds and in their ear or whatever. So that's not a bad thing necessarily.
So Amazon is just a giant flea market. There's nothing you can do about it, but if people like it, they like it.
Yeah. And Amazon, I think a lot of people especially writers kind of have a love-hate relationship with Amazon, and I try to support independent bookstores whenever I can. I do a lot of meet and greets and book signings and things with independent bookstores. Love working with independent bookstores. But the reality is that if you want to be a writer, you've got to work with Amazon. And Amazon's been really good to me. Dark Shell Lies was the editor's pick, which was really helpful. So there's some great things about that relationship too. And you just kind of try to go with that and lead with that and kind of
do you think
not dwell too much on anything else.
Do you think there might be a trend that the literary agents will try to negotiate in contracts that the author can self-publish, no more than 12% of the books on Amazon, so that you could get sort of a little bit of the best of both worlds?
There are people that do that now. I don't know.
I'm never first to think of anything.
Yeah, there are people that specifically have written in their contracts, that they can self-publish, whether they've got like a separate series that they're working on that they want to retain the rights to self-publish. So that is something that under some circumstances can be worked out. There's things like hybrid publishing, which is kind of like part self-publishing, part traditional publishing, where you work with an agent, but you do have you retain some of the rights, that come with self-publishing. And I knew, like I said, that I didn't want to be a self-published writer because I don't have the skill set to do the marketing, the contract negotiation, the legal stuff, to get it out in foreign markets. That's so overwhelming. But some people do, and for them that's great. I also knew that, and this is certainly not the case for everybody. There are a lot of self-published writers that do really well. And like I said, I've got a friend that has had phenomenal success self-publishing in particular genres. She writes sort of dark romance, and that's like a really hot thing in the self-publishing world. But I knew that if I did that, I would end up making enough money maybe to like buy myself lunch at McDonald's once a week. And I have a kid that was going to college, and I was like, I need to make some actual money. So for me, it was important to look towards something that was more aligned with my specific goals for what I wanted to accomplish. But definitely there are hybrids, and there are people that sort of kind of straddle both those lines, and it can be done. It's a tricky, you got to know both sides of the businesses, which is really hard.
All right, well, let's go back to ghosts, and specifically your ghost, where you've got a young woman who meets herself and her deceased mother at the edge of the ocean in New England, where I'm picturing it to be like, midnight mass type, gloomy fog.
Yeah, it's definitely like I always tell people because I'm in Florida. It's a beach setting, but it's not a Florida beach setting. It's a very New England sort of beach, which is a very different beach experience. But yeah, it's dark, it's foggy, it's all of that kind of stuff. And there are a lot of ghosts. Secrets So Deep is more of a ghost story, whereas Dark Eternal Lies is more sort of a mystical, psychic story. But the ghosts in Secrets So Deep are not traditional ghosts. There are lots of different types of ghosts in that story. I told you earlier that I started out, generally my stories came from a question and like the seed of a question. And the question for that story that I wanted to play with was, what does it mean to be haunted? And what are the different ways you can be haunted, and what are the different things that can haunt you, and how does that manifest? So there are ghosts in that story very much, but they are definitely not your typical sort of traditional ghosts.
Okay. Now, without giving too much away or anything away, in your version of ghosts, is it spirits that are bound to Earth or geography, or are they interdimensional? I mean, when someone meets themselves, there's a question there. So what was your interpretation of ghosts, or is that giving away too much of the twist?
Yeah, I don't want to say exactly what they turn out to be, but the question is a little bit of both. And it turns out that Whisper Cove, which is the name of the place where this theater is in the story, is very. Think of it sort of. I went into it sort of thinking it in terms of like the haunting of Hill House. This is a place where things happen that are unlike what happens anywhere else.
Right.
So it's a place that sort of has its own rules and its own ghosts and its own reasons for those manifestations and those hauntings, and they all come out of very much this unusual place.
Yeah, I found 3 genres of ghosts. One, they inhabit a place or geography for a certain reason or reasons. The other is like sort of the more Asian, where they stay with their families for better or worse. It's sort of ancestral descendant type of, and there's usually some type of love, misplaced or otherwise, involved in it. So they haunt a family, or they haunt a person, which oftentimes looks and feels a lot like possession. Those are sort of like the 3 ghosts.
Yeah, these ghosts. This is a ghost story that very much plays with the idea of memory. and very much sort of blurs the lines between what's real and what's not real. And that's why I wanted to set it, particularly in that coastal setting. I've always sort of been drawn to those places that are in between, sort of the land and the sea, and like the bayou is very much that way too. And those are natural places, I think, to play with the blurring of the line between what's real and what's not real.
Right, your geographic Halloweens, so to speak, or Samhain, it's more appropriately said. Excellent. And you have a third book coming out in 2 years. Do you want to give us the trailer on that one?
Yeah, sure. Right now it's called One Last Breath. That could definitely change. Both of the titles for the other two books changed multiple times during the time between, I signed the contract and the time they came to print. So if you don't ever see a book called that, look for a different title because it may be different. But it's a story that is set in Florida. Which is fun, and it's in the freshwater springs of Central Florida, and it's about a girl who is a free diver in the springs there, and she's obsessed with a cold case murder that happened in her town before she was born, and it's about sort of the connection she comes to find between her and these girls that died many years before her. And there's some supernatural, paranormal aspects to that as well. And sort of that discovery of how she's tied to that case in ways that she didn't realize. So it's another creepy sort of thriller story with some paranormal elements. In that way, it's similar to the first two.
Okay, very good. So the working title is?
One Last Breath.
One Last Breath. But you're not going to change your name anytime soon, so look for the name and not necessarily the title.
Something by me, like I said, that's the working title, but often, especially like when you've got a publisher like Penguin who does such a great job with like marketing, they've got a whole marketing team whose idea it is just to figure out like what is the best thing to call this book to make it stand out in the market and to appeal to people. So I tend to leave that up to them. If they think something's better, then I've never been married to a particular title, so it may change.
Excellent. By the way, Hill House, I loved it on Netflix. I'm told that the book is actually different and that I should read it, which means I'll probably get it on Audible because I have lost the capacity to read.
It's not very long either, so it's pretty quick listen. Yeah, definitely.
Cool. And I love Bly Manor, and I absolutely love Midnight Mass. I wasn't so keen on the Midnight Club, which was more probably the young adult geared one. I don't know. It didn't do anything for me, but that's not really what I want to ask. Are you familiar with, are there any filmmakers or authors that inspire you or you particularly love?
I'm really bad when it comes to film. Like, there are films that I love, but I am not a film buff, and I tend to just go into them and enjoy them and not necessarily pay attention to them. When people are like, oh, I love, and they name a director or even an actor, I'm a lot of times like, I have no idea who that is. So that's not something I know, but yeah, I love, I loved Hill House, on Netflix. Definitely, I love the atmosphere and the mood of that. And there are a lot of things. I loved Bates Motel on as well. So like that genre of stuff and that sort of atmosphere I love. And as far as books go, I grew up reading a lot of Shirley Jackson, and I grew up reading Lois Duncan, and sort of a lot of things along those lines. And I read a lot of like sort of gothic mysteries. Rebecca was probably my favorite book, as an adolescent. It was the first sort of adult book that I read that I was like, oh, I love this. And it was that combination of like atmosphere and mystery and romance sort of all rolled up together. And so those are always been the kind of stories that I gravitate toward, and those are still sort of my favorite.
What's your favorite horror or thriller book?
Oh gosh, it's not really that question gets asked a lot, and it's always so hard to answer because as soon as anybody asks it, my brain kind of blanks out, and it's like book. Have I ever read a book? Let me think.
You wrote some.
Right, the kind of person that my favorite tends to be whatever I read last that I really enjoyed. And so my favorite recently has been a book called Just Like Home, Sarah Gailey, and it's a really just creepy, atmospheric sort of claustrophobic horror thriller story. It's an adult book, but I loved that one. That's sort of a recent one. There's a book called The Accident Season, Maura Fowley Doyle, that was sort of not the inspiration, but sort of a book that I read when I was thinking about beginning to write young adult. I thought, this is the kind of story I want to tell. This is the kind of thing that I like. So that was very much sort of an inspirational book.
I also have trouble with favorites, so I'm not going to limit you to a favorite. What are some examples of some horror thriller based TV and or movies that are sort of in that are like your comfort shows, the ones that you want to watch if you want to be scared?
So yeah, like I mentioned, Bates Motel. My son and I have love that series and have watched it like a couple of times. That is probably one of my very all-time favorite series, because I think it's just such a creative take on that seed of an idea, that really sort of turned it around and ran with it. And I love that one. Dexter is probably my all-time favorite. I'm a huge Dexter fan. I watched it multiple times. And what I'm really drawn to there is I love that combination of like horror but also comedy. It's such a like dark show, but it's such a funny show too. And so I love that. That combination always has really appealed to me. Those are the two that I probably go back to most often.
Okay. And if you were on a desert island and there was one author you wanted to have their catalog, who might that be?
Oh, gosh. Well, if I'm going to be stuck there for a long time, I'd want somebody who'd written a lot of stuff.
Probably.
So I don't know. That's a hard question. I am not a series reader at all. So that it would be hard for me to pick somebody who had a bunch of different stuff. I know a lot of people love series. I've just never really been into them. I tend to sort of get bored with the same characters. And I also, just want to move on to something, a storyline that's different or location that's different or whatever. So it's hard for me to say. There's a lot of Stephen King that I love, but there's also a lot of Stephen King that I don't love.
I have the same relationship with Stephen King. It says there's
I either really like it or I'm really like, I don't like that at all.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd have to think about that one. That's a hard question to answer.
Though his son's work I find to be much more consistent for my tastes anyway.
Yeah, I get a little bit lost in it gets a little long for me. Kind of the pacing, which is part of the reason I really love. I read mostly what I read now, of course, because I'm writing it and interested in it. Are young adult thrillers and young adult mysteries, young adult horror, and I really love the pacing in those stories. Adult stories. You can get to like chapter 27 of an adult book and still be like, when is this story going to start? What is going on? But young adult tends to jump right in and get moving and the pacing. So I always tell people, that's a difference as far as young adult goes. The writing is not simpler or less complex by any means. It's the exact same writing is for an adult, but it's the pacing that is really different.
I think it might be harder because you have to sort of erase some of what you've lived and learned and sort of relearn it again or pretend that you hadn't. It's sort of hard to put yourself in that space. Now, luckily for me, it's not hard because I have the maturity level of a 14-year-old boy, but luckily for authors out there, I don't have the patience to write or maybe any of the other skills either. I'll just go with patience to make myself feel better. I also feel an angry email coming from my friend Derek, who does the Wheel of Ka podcast. Fans of this show may know them from the Midnight Myth podcast. Both him and his lovely wife have been on my show, and he does a show called Wheel of Ka, all about Stephen King. So I know that's his favorite. So sorry, Derek.
I love a whole lot. Particularly, the thing I love best are the short stories. Like I said, because sometimes the other ones get along. But yeah, big fan. Love the short stories. Don't write any angry emails.
So the guys had like 45 books. They can't all be winners.
Right, exactly.
And so, all right. What's your go-to monster or creature of the occult?
Oh, I don't really know that I have a go-to one. But I have a long-lasting childhood fascination with werewolves. That was my favorite as a kid. And I still kind of have this, I mean, I think it's the idea of that transformation that always really interested me. And I've not written a werewolf story, but there is, in Dark and Shallow Lies, I did manage to work in a little werewolf thread. There's a mythical, that basically what he is the Cajun werewolf, called the Rougarou. Which is a sort of a half man, half beast animal that sort of prowls the swamps and the bayous of Louisiana in Cajun folklore. And I managed to give him sort of like a cameo appearance in there, which made me really happy. And I think probably the reason I love the werewolf, like the Wolfman, was probably the old, I don't know, like 1930 or black and white, and was probably the first ever horror movie that I saw. I watched it with my dad when I was, like 7 or 8, and was unreasonably terrified and scarred by it. And I think probably the first thing, like your first scarring experience, sort of stays with you. So I've always kind of loved that idea in that story, and also the fact that it appears in so many cultures. That exact thing by so many names finds its way into every culture around the world, which is a really cool thing.
Even where there's not wolves, there's like in Africa, there's were hyenas.
Right.
Someplace there's were tigers. But what do you think is the origin of the werewolf?
I think that's the other thing I like about it is I think it's a really psychological monster. Like that idea of transformation into something dangerous, or like fearing our transformation into the worst part of ourselves. I think that's a universal human thing. Whether you've watched someone transform themselves into something unrecognizable and dangerous, or whether you fear the transformation of yourself into something unrecognizable and dangerous and out of your control. I just think that's a sort of a psychological seed that sort of we all have.
Yeah, it's a less subtle Jekyll and Hyde, but it also, like, I think sometimes we forget that people told scary stories and made scary songs so kids could learn certain things. And it might have been the easiest boogeyman for kids, 10, 20, 100,000 years ago to tell time, to know like the months, to follow the cycle of the months, because that was important. But also, like, it's like I've seen articles recently that people are, everyone opines contrary things, but they said the wolves domesticated man, not the other way around. I'm not really sure I believe that, but there is something that there was for a time that wolves and humans, whether they were humans or, Homo erectus at the time, I don't really know. But, they were competing for apex predator status in the same environment. And maybe that had something to do with it, that you were sort of trying to blend the two worlds, but it went wrong. It's like, maybe it's sort of like a stick with your own and will be stronger kind of myth.
Yeah, sure.
And othering, one of maybe the oldest othering, before we had the hill people and the valley people. I don't know. We've always needed monsters, I guess, but
yeah, definitely. And I did need monsters. Those scary story. I think some people sort of think, scary stories for kids or especially younger kids. I write for young adults, but especially people that write like middle grade horror, and they think, why would you write that kind of story for kids? But there's so much to be learned from those experiences and how we deal with the darkness in our lives. And kids feel that fear, and they feel that we all do. So to give them the tools and the stories and the vocabulary to kind of work through it and express it is a really important thing.
Okay, so I always have this catch-all question, which there may be no answer to, but it's, what didn't I ask you that I should have asked you?
Oh gosh, I think the only thing that we didn't talk about that is sort of interesting is the fact that I came into writing coming from a family of writers. So I grew up, around writers. My mom was a writer, and she's got a lot of 19 published novels, mostly middle grade historical fiction. My dad was a poet. And so I grew up in a house that always had writers coming and going. Even though I never was a writer, I was always a theater. That was kind of my thing. We always had writers in our house. My mom was always going to writers' conventions, and I very much grew up in a house where literature and the written word were valued and sort of front and center in everything in everyday life. And if you ask kind of like what made me a writer, what gave me the ability to know that I could be a writer, I think that experience of that, my childhood experience, was really central to that. And even though I would have said at the time that I wasn't paying attention to that, or I wasn't gleaning anything from that because I wasn't writing and I wasn't going to be a writer, evidently somewhere, in the back of my head, I did. So that was a really important thing.
Excellent. Where can people? I mean, it sounds like they can find your stuff anywhere. Go to a bookstore, go online, But where's your preferred places for people to find and support your books or anything else you have?
Yeah, so you can find either of those books, basically anywhere that sells books. You can get them on Amazon, you can get them at any Barnes & Noble. If you've got a local independent bookstore, I'd love for you to walk in there and pick up some copies there. That's a great thing to do, support those independent booksellers, because they do a lot for writers. But basically anywhere you get books, you can find either one of those. You can also find me online. I'm Ginny Meyer Sane on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter, and Facebook, all that kind of stuff. So if you do all those things, follow me there, and you'll get updates and information and stuff about books and about what I'm up to and about writing in general and all that kind of stuff. So lots of places to connect. I have a website, JinnyMeyersSane.com, that also has like updates and information and all that stuff, so you can check there as well. But yeah, basically anywhere.
What is the song that you want me to play as the outro that you would associate with your work?
Oh gosh. I don't have a particular song. I listen to different playlists for both of those books, and there's not really anything I can come up with that would be like one particular song, but definitely something creepy. If you've got something creepy yet pretty, that's what I would say.
Creepy yet pretty. Well, it sounds like I don't know. Maybe email me a suggestion when you're not on the spot, and I'll put it in. Yes, I probably won't drop the show for a week. I think this is going to be a very good intermezzo. I've had some very heavy shows recently. I've had some of my shamanic trilogy, and then we did one on who were the Huns and who are the Hungarians. So I think this is going to be a nice change of pace going into the Christmas season. So yeah, but I will look for something spooky and pretty at the same time. You put things into YouTube, and sometimes you actually get what you ask for. So
I know, right? Yeah, sometimes you do.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for your generosity. The New York Times bestselling author, congratulations for your success. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you being on The Garden of Doom. So folks, check out her books, buy them, read them, give her reviews. They make great Christmas, Hanukkah, any holiday you celebrate gift. And listen, the gift of reading is exercising the brain, and that's very important. And don't be like me and forget how to read. So folks, thanks very much. Thanks for tuning into The Garden of Doom, and you'll hear from us again next week.
All right, thank you.